Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise and Fall podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Florian, and Aleksey. Today's discussion will be on the future of education. And I think we all agreed that Keith would sort of go first on this. And the two main themes were what would be the effects of technology on all this? And then also, we have an echo somewhere. Is somebody playing this video live too? Okay. Yeah, so one of them was, what's the course of the industry itself as an educational profession in the academy? And then also, what is the effect of new technologies such as like AI and the internet on the future of education? So we'll start with you, Keith.
Well, when we look at the condition of education today in the United States, and we could do a critique of education at every level, from the K through 12 level all the way up to the post-grad level, we see increasingly a business model that's being used that was identified back in the early 90s by a sociologist named George Ritzer as mcdonaldization. And what the mcdonaldization thesis is that this is an idea Ritzer came up with to describe how institutions in the United States are increasingly being organized like a McDonald's. And if you look at what the McDonald's business model is, it's very much about quantity over quality. I mean, McDonald's doesn't advertise their products as health food. They don't advertise their restaurants as fine dining or luxury establishments. Instead, it's just the opposite. McDonald's, the furniture in a McDonald's is designed to be somewhat uncomfortable. They don't want people lounging in McDonald's. They want people to get in, get their fast food, eat, and get out so they can get more customers in. That's the McDonald's business model. And everything McDonald's does is oriented towards that. It's all about volume and quantity, and who cares about quality. And Ritzer pointed out that increasingly other kinds of institutions, including non-commercial institutions, were being organized on that model in the United States. This was in the early 90s, 30 years ago, when Ritzer was writing. And one institution that Ritzer talked about was education. He talked about how increasingly educational institutions are being organized like businesses, and students are viewed as customers. And it's not necessarily about providing quality service to the customer or even giving the customer the best deal. Rather, it's merely about volume. It's all about, get the customer in and out, get the customer's money and move on. And if we look at the way that the educational system works today, we see that that's the case. Most of my experience is in higher education. I've worked in or around higher education. First as a student, obviously, but then as a graduate student, and then as an instructor. I've been in and around graduate level education, or at least secondary level education, for over 30 years. And increasingly, I see the higher education adopting this McDonaldization model, where students are viewed as customers. Like, there's the question of why university tuition costs so much. The cost of university education has increased multiple times in the last 20 years or so. And one reason for that is that universities are increasingly offering all sorts of extraneous services to try to justify jacking up the price of tuition. For instance, at my alma mater, they have things like simulated rock climbing in the gym and things like that. And increasingly, university campuses are being organized as the equivalent of resorts, where you go. It's like and many educational institutions, like there's one educational institution where I teach, that the average student tuition is somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 a year. And this is not a very high level school. This is not like an Ivy League school or anything like that. And some educational institutions are more like $50,000 a year. Some may be even more. So what these are doing is that these institutions are encouraging students to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for what amounts to going camping, to going to a resort or going on vacation for 5 years or so. And in the process, the goal is to get more and more students in. It's not only to raise the costs, but to get more and more students in. So the students are being encouraged to take out student loans. You can't pay for college, fine, just take out a student loan. So more and more students are going through 4 or 5 years of college and coming out of school with debts in the six figures, something, $200,000 debt. And student loan debt is not like a lot of other debts. It's not dischargeable in personal bankruptcy, like say a credit card debt or something like that. Also, parallel to that, the quality of the education that's being provided is actually declining significantly. One reason for that is in order to bring in a greater number of students, you have to lower the standards as to who can be admitted to an institution. For instance, there's this one major state university not far from me that it used to be their acceptance rate was roughly in the 50% range of applicants, meaning, of all the people who apply to this university, they might take half of them. Now it's something like 90%. I think at my alma mater, when I first went there, it was something like, it was a state university. I think it was initially something like 70%. Now it's past 90%. I know of some schools where it's practically 100%. I mean, these are universities. These are actual 4-year liberal arts colleges that essentially have no standards for admission. And that's also certainly true of the community colleges as well. The community colleges will take anyone, as will these online schools. These online schools are becoming increasingly common. University of Phoenix, that business model, Grand Canyon University, all that kind of stuff. They take anyone. But nowadays, the actual universities, the actual 4-year liberal arts universities are taking just about anyone as well. And in order to be able to take all these students, they have to dumb down the curriculum. And they increasingly have to offer degree programs that are worthless. For instance, if you have someone whose actual academic ability is basically on the high school or middle school level, well, obviously you're not going to teach advanced physics to people like this. They're not going to be in scientific or technological or mathematical programs. They're going to be in liberal arts and humanities programs, and even those, they have to be dumbed down to accommodate the quality of students. And that's why you increasingly see students getting degrees in absolutely worthless things. Like there are jokes that go around nowadays about someone who's working as a Starbucks barista who has a degree in queer theory or ancient Aztec art or something like basketball or I've heard of college classes being taught on Taylor Swift music and on Star Wars and all kinds of stuff. And the question is, why are universities actually offering classes like this? And the reason why is it's a way to justify budgetary expenditures. It's a way of getting more and more students into school, into colleges, and collecting tuition payments from these students. Now, that's not to say that all education is worthless. I think this is a mistake that some people who criticize the educational system make. It's not that the universities, many of the major universities, do not have good departments when it comes to, say, technology, advanced sciences, mathematics, and in some cases, humanities as well. But what they do is they add on all these extra activities that are intended for the students that can't do normal academic work. Also, some of this is politically motivated. So some of it is about being inclusive. So they'll create all these kinds of garbage curriculums that have some sort of inclusionary theme or some kind of diversity theme to them. Some of it has to do with complying with requirements imposed by the Department of Education and institutions like that in terms of diversity mandates and all of these kinds of things as well. So that's where education is now. Education, like I've noticed, I work in several different fields related to education, and I've noticed that the quality of students, college students, has diminished significantly over the years. Some years ago, when I first started teaching college students, I noticed a whole lot of college students really were not college material. They were more high school level. And I started noticing, after that more and more students were increasingly on the middle school level in terms of their reading comprehension ability, writing skills, ability to follow directions, things like that. And increasingly, I'm coming across students that seem to me to be on the elementary school level. For instance, I once had a student not long ago ask me a question about why I do not use cartoons to illustrate academic concepts in class. Just thinking that that's normal education, that's just how education is done. We're going to show cartoons about I teach the social sciences, about social science concepts. And I said, well, because we don't do that in the university. That's elementary school. But you actually have a student who think this is like some actual way that we're going to be teaching in college. And also you find students increasingly who are completely indifferent to their coursework. For instance, I've had many classes over the years just as an instructor, where if I've got 50 people enrolled in the class, I would have about a 50% absentee rate during any class session. Maybe sometimes less than that. I mean, sometimes if I had 50 people enrolled in a class, I might have 20 that would show up for an individual class. I've had classes where I had students enrolled in the class for the entire semester that turned in not one assignment during the entire semester, and then would ask why they failed. I have students that don't understand why it's inappropriate in academia to cut and paste Wikipedia articles and as assignments and turn them in as papers, as term papers. I've had students that don't understand why they can't. I had a student one time who turned in his term paper, and it was actually his girlfriend's term paper from the previous semester, and she had been in my class as well. So he took her old paper and turned it in as his paper with her name on it, no less. And when I told him that this is inappropriate, he didn't understand why it's a problem. He says, "I turned the paper in," and I'm like, "Yeah, but it's supposed to be your paper, not your girlfriend's paper." I mean, if you're going to cheat, at least be somewhat more clandestine about it. And come on. This is the kind of stuff that we're increasingly seeing in academia. I mean, that kind of thing wasn't even that commonplace when I was in high school or middle school. Nowadays, we see it in the university system. So that's where education is now. I mean, higher education is increasingly becoming just a glorified high school, and in some instances, a glorified middle school, where students are essentially paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to summer camp for 5 years. I mean, that's really what college is. It's like we're going to go to college and we're going to drink beer and go to football games and play in the gym and go to the student center and play video games and we're going to pay we're going to run up a $300,000 debt for this. That's the business model that higher education operates on. And as far as AI. One thing that's interesting about AI is that nowadays you have students that use AI to do their homework, and professors are increasingly trying to keep up with that and prevent that. So now you have this counter AI software that a lot of schools or instructors are using, but there's actually ways around that as well. So I'm wondering how AI is going to affect education in the future. Because it's going to be a real dilemma, because I tend to think that it's going to go the same way as the entertainment industry. I know recently some of the Hollywood actors and writers went on strike, and one of their issues there was AI. They were saying AI is taking jobs away from Hollywood writers because now they just write a script for a film or whatever with AI, or it's taking jobs away from actors because they'll just get an image of an actor and then reuse that image for AI purposes to create, a backdrop of people in a film, as opposed to using a bunch of extras. And I suspect that will eventually become the norm in academia as well. It'll just be an expected norm that, students write papers with AI or students or AI is just integrated into the educational process. Just like the same way that many schools nowadays, elementary schools, do not teach cursive writing, because the rationale behind that is, well, you don't need to know cursive writing. You don't even need to know writing, period. You just need to know how to type. So some of these skills are being phased out. And I suspect that AI will have the same effect as computers have had when it comes to things like writing skills.
Right. So I think also a few things to point out is when we look at like education, we need to sort of ask what is the purpose of education. So I forget where I read this, but one of the C.S. Lewis's nonfiction works, he talked about touring this school that was sort of like a contemporary, modern, up-to-date school, and it had all of these, it educated people in all these technical fields. But then he asked them, well, okay, but what kind of student are you graduating? What kind of person is going to walk out your doors? And the schoolmaster's like, I have no idea. And C.S. Lewis said this was a horrible idea, because like you're just giving people these tools, this toolkit, but you're not telling them anything more than that. And that's I mean, C.S. Lewis died in 1963, so this is probably sometime between the 40s and that. The idea is we don't have a coherent conception of what an educated person ought to be. Now, there used to be in the West, and this is also, quote unquote, not partisan in the sense that you could be politically left or politically right and still hold this. There was the idea of the Western canon, the idea of the great tradition that, everybody had to be familiar with. And so you might find in the 50s and 60s authors and writers and politicians who were both liberal and conservative who were engaged in this, who had their identity shaped by being exposed to this. That was eliminated in the 80s. We have Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, where he talks about this and bemoans that fact, blaming it on, in part, the student radical movement of the 60s and 70s, which he identified as a kind of like proto-fascism, which is interesting. And so we don't really have an education system in the United States, in the sense that we don't really have a goal for what an educated man ought to look like on the other end. After 1945, with the World War II and the reliance on technology and research and development to win that war, as well as the atom bomb project in the United States, the humanities took a nosedive in favor of STEM. I think it was you, Keith, a few years ago that had an article on either Attack the System or on your social media, where it said that like on 100 to 1, STEM outspent the humanities on education. And it just shows that there's just no money in it, and it's eventually getting phased out. Part of it, I wonder, is if it's like 1984, right? If people are ignorant of the past and they can't understand the future. That might be part of it. But we're seeing a point now where even, quote, STEM education is challenged with the sort of, you can think of like a lot of the new atheists have sort of rethought their hostility to the Christians. Dawkins a couple of years ago said that the whole crusade was a mistake and that we need Christians to help defeat the wokies. He literally said that like a year ago. So the idea being that even their own STEM fields are at risk due to this is, it's almost like there's certain assumptions in the system that the system isn't able to push back against because it's too close to core values that they already have, which fundamentally undermines their conception of education. And so they have to keep either A, getting rid of stuff because it's quote unquote obsolete in the face of modern technological development, or they have to keep changing what needs to be taught in order to keep up with the basic principles of the system, the society. And a common libertarian anarchist critique of modern public education is that it originated from the Prussian system, which was meant to produce, obedient workers and obedient soldiers, which is much the case in the United States. It's a kind of elaborate socialization into the warfare state, which is largely true. It doesn't teach you to think for yourself. It doesn't teach you to question authority. It doesn't teach you how to think, but what to think. And it creates this industrial type mass production system. And then this is a common libertarian anarchist critique that's been around for centuries. And I think it's still largely correct. Now, it might be, adapted now to a digital age rather than the industrial age in which this originally critique was formulated. And ultimately, I don't think there is no actual end for what an educated man ought to be in the current system. And the ultimate crisis in education, there are, of course, technical failures, and Keith did a good job of outlining those. But ultimately, there's no concept of what an educated person looks like. And that's the real problem that we're having now. Florian.
I very much agree with that. And funny that you brought up the American education system, like the Prussian system. This is actually true. There was the guy Horace Mann, I think was his name, and he introduced that in the beginning to middle of the 19th century. So it's basically 150 years old. And we talked about that. I don't know whether you were part of that discussion, Todd, but we talked about it earlier that that the entire woke culture is kind of like Bismarckian in its principles, right? And it would fit so like with the social welfare state having more of a role, and the state itself, the government having more of a role shaping how people can live. And that is so it's funny that it's basically showing that the school system would be very well suited for perpetuating that kind of like wokeism. So wokeism and the school system, the Prussian school system, are a good fit. Um, but I also have to say that I think you can't just apply a Germanic system, which the Prussian system is, to a country that's based on Anglo-American principles. There's a huge difference between these two philosophies. And in Germany, I have to say, lots of the problems that we see in the US, especially how does an educated person look like, we don't have that in Germany. Because in Germany, you have actually people that are proud of becoming public servants. They're really proud of that. That's like their fulfillment in life. They are public servant. They are very happy about that. They worked hard to get there. They tell you, and it's like everything is great, and they feel it as an honor to serve the state. And in Germany, we also have like a lot of additional culture. So every city in Germany has museums. Every city in Germany has an own orchestra, and so the public school system is always supplemented by the arts and history, culture, and everything. You can't criticize that the entire zeitgeist. Referring to the arts and history and music in Germany, you can criticize that, but the fact is still that this creates a more balanced mix of people that get through the system. And then in Germany, you also have something like a guild system for people who want to become mechanics. You need to have a diploma to become an engineer. So there's external rules that are foisted up on schools. So schools cannot just teach like theater arts to kids. Theater may be part of a school production, but an extracurricular stuff. They will not have that as main subjects, because main subjects the students have to know about engineering standards, for example, right? If they want to go to engineering school later on. So in Germany, it's more balanced, and it's probably education system works better in Germany because the whole society is more homogeneous, right? And there's more a common goal. That doesn't quite exist in the US. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Prussian school system produces more automatons that are nothing but automatons. I remember one of my earliest advisors when I studied biochemistry. He did a postdoc at Yale University, and he told me, and I didn't find that so often true, but he had seen it himself. He said that American students are not very independent. He said like there was one student, he almost had to like accompany the guy to the restroom. That was the level of dependence that students still had, and that was Yale in 1993. So maybe there's the general upbringing of students here in the U.S. system that doesn't quite work well in making students like independent, cultivated, educated people, right? Question is whether you need to be an educated, cultivated a person, but it works better in Germany than in the US.
Okay, Alexei.
All right, so we have a lot to go over. I'll start with Keith, the George Ritzer paradigm about the McDonaldization of society. You may recall that I actually wrote an article for your blog, the McDonaldization of the American system of education. But you're right on the money there, and I argue for that exactly. That the process of education in America is highly standardized in ways you've described. And we see this every day. So what do we do at academic composition? So a client signs up with me. They have an 8-week class or a 4-week class or a 6-week class, and I charge them a standard fee. I usually give it to you, Keith, and you know exactly how much time it takes to get it done. And the client knows exactly how much money they need to pay, and they know exactly when the class is going to be done, and so on and so on and so on. But this has always been the case. However, it's gotten much more streamlined since the pandemic. You see, before the pandemic, the majority of our customers were traditional students in a way. Well, even if they were older, they had to go to an actual classroom, and they had to bring their assignment instructions to us, and they had to communicate with us about their guidelines. But once the pandemic started, what we've seen is a rapid acceleration of the McDonaldization of American education. This is when classes have been almost entirely online. This is when there was no longer any doubt that a paradigm shift has been afoot, that had happened. That from that point on, the online students have outnumbered traditional students by more than 100 to 1. In fact, I'm hard-pressed to think of a single customer that we have at academic composition who is a traditional student. And this is the finest example of McDonaldization of education. And what are the key tenets of McDonaldization? Well, reliability, consistency, timeliness, and above all, pricing. There's got to be maximum predictability. And having lived in Spain, I've noticed the contrast between a McDonaldized society and a less so. So when I wandered around the streets of Malaga, I've noticed that at any point I had the liberty to go to a Starbucks or a McDonald's and get my immediate burger or a cup of coffee in a McDonaldized way, in a manner that is consistent, that is cost effective, and predictable. Yet I often chose to put up with a terrible customer service that I got at a Spanish cafe. Why is that? Why haven't McDonald's and Starbucks put all these local mom and pop shops out of business? Because there is a fundamental flaw with the American way of life that people of the world see. So from the perspective of McDonaldization, the end product, the result is what matters. It's got to be cheap. It's got to be up to the customer's level of satisfaction, and it's got to be timely. Yeah, the intrinsic experience, as Keith suggests, also matters. That a lack of quality is fundamentally problematic with the McDonaldized way of life. But wait a minute. So if McDonald's and Starbucks and GM are such terrible companies in terms of quality, why do people keep on coming back to them? The obvious answer is that they have a semblance of quality. For instance, I had a Ford Explorer for over a decade. And when I bought that, I didn't think it was a terrible car, but obviously marketing is part of the reason why I thought it was fine. It has been a while since it became common knowledge that McDonald's had real quality control issues. So as far as the American way of life is concerned, there must be a semblance of quality, and this is what we have with education. How does the magician do the trick? Well, essentially, a lot of these universities that will teach you gender studies will tell you that American system of education is the envy of the world. You see, there are so many wealthy people from all over the map who want to come to the United States to study medicine, to study chemistry, to study the exact sciences, and therefore, if you get that piece of paper with your degree in women's studies from the University of Chicago, and that's got to be valued. And in fact, some of the power elites from foreign countries have studied at American universities. Say, for example, Rafael Correa, former president of Ecuador, was a student at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Illinois. And in fact, we know quite a few clients of our own who are studying political science at that exact same institution. And if my memory serves me right, one of these distinguished gentlemen wanted to write a major paper, not quite a thesis or dissertation, but a 50-page essay on why Arab international students used private tutors. And he even came back to us with a critical observation. We were writing about Arab American students when we should have been writing about the Arab international students. So what is my point with this? My point with this is that this is American marketing at its finest. That Middle Eastern young man has not become any wiser because of such intellectual exploits. And it's doubtful that this degree that we helped them get ahead in life at all. Yet marketing has done its trick. It's not a coincidence that David Copperfield has made his fortune in America. The magician almost always gets his way in the United States, but that is less so in other countries where people tend to have a more of an instinctive sense of distrust of advertising. So to put it all together, mcdonaldization in America is part of a broader cultural trend that comes with a semblance of quality, that comes with a salesman's refrain of volume. And the way to achieve, the way to maximize volume above all is to merely expend and just enough time and energy to convince the customer that the quality is sufficient, rather than to regard the product as the product's quality is desirable in its own right. And what is the implication of this? What is the implication of the snake oil that we're all buying in the case of education? And I mean the majority of what goes on at the university. I'm not denying that the United States excels in STEM degrees in natural sciences. Well, the implication, I would say, is quite similar to what we've seen with the automotive industry. The automotive industry in the United States has fallen upon hard times, and I've witnessed this personally, having grown up in Michigan. In 2008, I was finishing my university and a degree, and I had to leave the Detroit area to pursue employment somewhere else. I believe that the future of the American education is going to be similar. Give it another 10 to 20 years, and we're going to be seeing much less demand for American academic credentials abroad. Now, we may still see Middle Eastern immigrants come into the United States to study medicine, as that kind of education is of reputable quality. However, this fine young man who asked us to write a paper on why Arab international students use private tutors, that's going to be a thing of the past. And let's not forget that reflecting on my experience, I would say that before 2014, I've seen by far more international students among us. Now, we still have them. And Keith, I know you work with several international students now, but I imagine they're becoming increasingly less common year after year. They exist, but the majority of the ones that we still do have been with us for well over a decade. Oh, that's my prediction, that we're going to be seeing significantly fewer non-specialized, non-STEM oriented foreign students in the U.S. as finally the public are growing wary of the subterfuge that the propagandists for the model of education have imposed upon us. They perpetrated a sort of an intellectual fraud, and that trick can only be effective for so long. It's going to be quite interesting to see what will happen in the next 5 years, though it's almost certain that the existing trends of disillusionment with education in America and abroad will persist. And it's even more certain in the next 10 years the reputation of the American system of education will no longer enjoy the kind of reputation that it enjoys today. There is no telling how much it will decline, but it is almost certain that it will be much less prestigious.
Yeah. So let's see. Somebody said, oh, yeah. What do you think of JT? What do you think of education standards on more reputable degrees like medicine or engineering? What will this mean for future professions? Well, I think one of the things that's the case is while the education industry has been inundated by objectively unqualified people, as Keith said, people that haven't even gotten out of high school in any sort of technical sense. At least with the STEM fields, obviously not the humanities, they still only pick the qualified people. And what this does is it creates this built-in pressure group for the left, because all of these quote diversity hires that never should have actually been in the school in the first place, based on the false belief of human fungibility that we're all fundamentally the same and interchangeable, can say, well, we were not picked not because we weren't good enough. The implication on the left-wing mindset is that they are good enough, but it was discrimination. So these people then end up getting hired as basically like political commissars for DEI boards, or just used as basically pressure groups in order to keep the culture war going. But they don't actually hire these people. Now, in the same goes for sports too, by the way. So if we look at like high school and college, most people see PE coaches are actually pretty garbage. All they do is they just pick the people that are naturally apt as athletes. I remember when I was taking PE, no one actually taught me anything useful. They're just like, well, you're no good at it, kid. So, we don't like you. But the ones who are good get right to the top. So why do you do that? Well, you want to depress the cost of labor, right? Athletes and engineers are some of the most expensive people you can hire, right? So how do you reduce the cost? Well, you flood the market with applicants, lying to people, saying that anybody can be a football player, anybody can be a computer engineer, anybody can be a bridge builder. And then when they can't make it and they complain about it, well, it's like, well, tough noogie, you should have worked harder. But the real people who are good enough don't know the value of their labor, so they can't actually demand higher contracts, at least early on in their career. And plus, they don't know that everybody else really isn't good enough to compete with them. So this is in part an effort to depress the cost of hiring workers. So the modern technological society, what it's done is it's offloaded to the taxpayer, because ultimately student loans are paid for by the government, i.e. taxpayer dollars, the cost of training the next generation of employees for their work. I mean, the entire business model would collapse if they had to, train on the job from their own budget these people, whether it's, the tech industry or professional sports. And so what they've done, as with many things, is they've offloaded the cost onto us, the taxpayer. And, as you've said, Alexei, this reduction in quality cannot continue forever. Eventually, people just won't put up with it anymore. And there's also the other factor. For example, if you go to like our teachers on Reddit, it's like a complete zoo. Like teachers can barely keep a lid on what's going on. The parents won't help them. So when they discipline children, the parents will then get mad at them and say, hey, you can't do that. And it's like, well, you're not even disciplining the kids at home, so you won't support me doing it here. And then also, a lot of kids are beginning to realize that this is a racket. Like, why am I learning this garbage? It's not going to help me get ahead in life. They'd probably have millennial older siblings that are like, it didn't help them get ahead in life, so it's not going to help me. And so there's this sense of, by saturating the market in order to allow a few key industries to hire competent personnel cheaply, you've essentially just destroyed any sort of like cause and effect between getting a degree and then getting some useful career at the other end. And that can only last so long before it just, it just destroys itself on both ends. Keith.
Well, I think one issue here that's going to affect the future of education quite a bit is going to be the financial aspect, irrespective of what anyone thinks of the content of the curriculum. One thing that we've started to see in the last few years, and I think this has been particularly true since the pandemic, but it was a trend that was starting prior to that, and that is college enrollment is actually going down. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one reason is that college is increasingly becoming more and more expensive. And while the economic conditions in the United States are deteriorating, fewer and fewer parents have money to send their kids to college for 4 or 5 years. Fewer and fewer parents are willing to hand over, say, $100,000 for their kids' college education. particularly if their kid's going to major in queer theory or something like that. So I think that's one reason why we've seen college enrollments decline. Also, I think the pandemic had the effect of decreasing college enrollments, in part because for a time universities were, that is, actual live classes were shut down and everything started going online. And a lot of students decided they liked online classes better because you don't have to actually go to class. And what I've noticed, though, about online classes, because I've taught online classes and live classes, is that students in online classes tend to take their classes a lot less seriously. They don't really think it's a real class. Like if it's a live class and it starts at 9:30, and you take attendance at the beginning of class, and there's assignments due on particular days, then students view that as like being in school. But if it's a online class where there's a discussion post that they're supposed to post in a discussion forum and respond to other students and watch videos and make comments and all the things that go into online classes, a lot of students just don't think that's a real class, and they have this idea that the work is not even real coursework, so they don't do any work. I've noticed that's very frequent in online classes. You'll have a lot of people enrolled in the class that never seem to actually do any work, and I think that has undermined not only the quality of education, but a lot of people's motivation as far as education. Also, more and more people are developing the idea correctly that having a college degree is not necessarily going to get you a better job or higher income. When I was growing up, the idea there was that they tried to get as many people into college as possible. Like when I was in high school, the thing is, well, you've got to take the college preparatory classes and that kind of stuff because you've got to be able to go to college, because if you want a good job and a high income, well, that's how you've got to do it. You've got to go to college. And they would also have and I know when I was in public high school, I only went to a public high school for 2 years, and that was over 40 years ago. But even then, the way they would do it is you had college preparatory students, and these were students that were taking more advanced classes, like they would take trigonometry and physics and advanced writing and that kind of stuff. And then they had the general studies students, and they would basically have a much lower set of requirements that they needed to graduate. And then you had the vocational students, and they would go from the high school campus over to a vocational campus for half the day and study auto mechanics or plumbing or something like that. And those were considered the loser students. I mean, you could tell that the staff viewed these as the throwaway students. Well, these are the ones that, we've got to teach them basic reading and writing, and then we can put them in carpentry class for the rest of their academic career. And it was thought that the ones that were going to go to college, that's the real education. And I think over time that it became the thing where they wanted everybody to go to college. They're pushing more and more people to go to college. And of course, colleges and all that have encouraged that way of thinking. And then another thing that happened was when you started having much more standardized education based on these state standards and these federal programs, like there's one called No Child Left Behind or something like that. The idea behind these things was you're going to have more standardized education, in localized school systems, ostensibly so that the students that are behind can catch up. But what it really does is it brings everybody down. Like I have nieces and nephews who were in their late teens and early 20s, so they're recent high school graduates, and they would talk about in school for them, everything is just about being able to pass these standardized tests. Like in Virginia, where I am, they're called the SOLs, which is an ironic name for these tests, but they're standards of learning is what they mean. But the other meaning of SOL is appropriate as well, because what they're doing is they're teaching, they're just trying to get students in shape to be able to pass these highly standardized tests, which means they don't really do any teaching. It's just more like, it's more on the level of when you're in first grade learning. Like when I was in first grade, again, that was a long time ago, but back then, one thing they would use for teaching is flashcards, where like to learn your mathematics, your basic mathematics, they show you a flashcard, and it's 2 + 2 equals, and then you're supposed to get it right, and then on the back of the card is the answer. So then after you guess your answer, they can tell you whether you got it right or wrong. It was almost like one of these some of these internet quizzes they have nowadays, like how knowledgeable are you about Major League Baseball or something. And increasingly, according to what my family members were telling me, teaching on that level was common in the middle schools and even high schools, where it's just all about trying to get these very basic facts, like some internet quiz or something down, so that the kids would know these things when they went to take the SOLs, and then they could do well on the SOLs. And then that affected the school system's budget. Like if you had a bunch of students that did well on the SOLs, then the school system would get more money. So it's all about bringing more money into the school system by making sure everybody gets a high score on these SOLs. So everything is just about preparing the students to take SOLs. So there's no personalization of education. It's very standardized. It's very bureaucratized. It's very McDonaldized. It's kind of like everybody gets a Big Mac. Everybody gets their order of fries. Everybody gets their Diet Coke.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, I got the impression that that was actually already a problem when I was at university. That the schools accept so many students that even in subjects that are relatively restricted in the number of people that normally sign up, like STEM. Now, if you want to become, so I studied biochemistry and biology. If you want to become if you want to work in the pharmaceutical industry, you need a PhD. Even though I know from my own experience, a master's is sufficient. But if the industry has lots of PhDs to choose from, yeah, well, then they choose a PhD, of course, and that means additional 3 to 4 years of your basic 3 or 4 years opportunity cost for you, right? There's no reason why you couldn't research that you're doing a PhD study already in the pharmaceutical company. So there's also one negative side effect of like schools accepting too many students. But I think there's also how the future could look like. There was a model that came up during the pandemic where students learn, like it was for STEM, and students could go to one of these colleges for free, and then they would sign a contract that the next job they get, they have to pay back 10% of their salary. And so that, of course, gets this university interested in giving students knowledge that they can actually use to get a job later on. And this is in alignment with some jobs that are in demand right now, like for cybersecurity. What you actually need are 4 certifications. That's it. I mean, you need 4 certifications, and then you apply with those, and you can basically get a job there. So I think the future in STEM will likely involve models like those, that more and more students say, that's a good deal. I do a boot camp, and then I can get a job at some good company instead of me having to sit through 4 years of college. I think that will be something that will be more attractive for the people that choose a STEM subject. And the non-STEM, I agree, they will probably decline in influence or in attendance also.
Okay, Aleksey.
All right, so here is one fundamental implication of the decline in education as we know it. You see, there is much confusion about what exactly education is. And to define this, let's take the Aristotelian approach. After all, you can't go wrong with Aristotle. For Aristotle, there was a difference between episteme and techne. Episteme means knowledge, broadly speaking. Techne means technique. So that's the difference between knowing how and knowing what. Now, as you mentioned, Tom, after World War II, the American system of education has been leaning heavily in favor of technique, in favor of practicality, in favor of knowing how rather than knowing what. In fact, if you read any book about cultural differences, say Erin Meyer's Culture Map, one of the first things she observes about the Anglo-Saxon culture, especially the American culture, is that it's extremely practically oriented. So the advice she gives to German engineers, for example, is that when they go to the United States, don't bore Americans with theory too much. Don't really give them a comprehensive overview of why your point of view has empirical evidence or why the logic is sound. Start with the practicalities. If you can't give them a brief summary of that, they're probably not going to care enough to pay any attention to the theoretical aspects of it. So this is a core problem. Now, one thing that we do know about the 1950s and 1940s is that although it was a time of stability, it was not the heyday of American liberty. In fact, I've read Robert Nozick's State, Anarchy, and Utopia not so long ago, and right there in the preface, the editor mentioned that in the 1950s, libertarianism was dead in the United States for all intents and purposes. This brings me back to our previous discussion of the fourth term that we've been reviewing for the last few podcasts. The 1950s represents the American high, and this is the period that we're going to be entering in about 10 years. This period is essentially defined by conformity, authoritarian intrusions into private life, and decline of civil liberties. What does this have to do with education? Well, education, as it really is really all about episteme, not techne. It's not a surprise that in many European countries, Northern European countries specifically, let's say Germany or Sweden or Finland, students tend to be stronger in the academic respects. While they may not be as practical as Americans, they generally have a better understanding of the fundamental facts of science or history or mathematics or what have you. That needs to be revitalized if it is to come back. And for Aristotle, being an educated person meant four things. The first of all meant being virtuous, and to be virtuous means to have to find the golden mean between two vicious extremes. So, for instance, as far as bravery is concerned, there is really no sense in being foolhardy and charging into battle with no considerations, and there is no sense in being a coward. There's got to be a golden mean there. The second aspect of Aristotle's conception of an educated person is practical ability, and this is where techne is relevant. But see, techne, it also means wisdom. It doesn't necessarily mean practical. That doesn't necessarily mean practical employable skills, such as say carpentry or computer programming. I'd say, if anything, this should not even be considered education at all. I'd say what we do need is a fundamental distinction between education, which is about episteme, and techne, which is about practical employable skills. One clear example of this is the computer programming bootcamp, which functions exactly as any technical school does. The student enrolls in the course for 3 to 6 months and studies intensely, and after that, he is employable. There is no need to conflate that with any kind of genuinely enlightening endeavors, such as philosophy, history, or sociology, and there is even less of a reason to enlighten him with religious or woke propaganda. So I would say that to fix education as it is in this country, we need to insist on a clear distinction between episteme and techne. Now, the third definition of Aristotle's conception, the third aspect of Aristotle's conception of an educated person is an intellectual accomplishment. That is common sense everywhere besides the United States. See that, generally speaking, that you can't really say that you're an educated person with a degree in computer science if you don't know basic history and you have no idea what a logical fallacy is. But then what are you going to say? Oh, I'm an idiot savant. I know how to solve any logical problem in computer science. No, what this means is that you are an accomplished practitioner of your craft. That's technical. But an educated person has got to be knowledgeable, intellectually fluid, and dynamic, and capable of joining us in this conversation in a discussion of rigorous topics that require critical thought. And finally, the fourth definition, and the most important in my opinion, the fourth aspect is the engagement in civic endeavors. This brings me back to John Dewey's conception of education and democracy. John Dewey went so far as to argue that for democracy to flourish, people need to be educated, but much confusion comes from what is meant by education. Yet if we take the Aristotelian definition of education, it suddenly makes more sense. Is it really a coincidence that Sweden and Denmark tend to score highly on the democracy index, yet their system of education seemingly meets the Aristotelian definition of education? I don't think it's a coincidence. Now, that is not to say that there are no exceptions. To be sure, Germany was the most educated country in Europe in the 1930s, and that ended up being a disaster. Japan was a highly educated country. Argentina was also the most educated country in South America when the national reconstruction process began in 1976 and slaughtered between 10 and 30,000 people. So there are pitfalls. It's entirely possible for education to become indoctrination. It's possible for it to be abused, but if it's administered properly, I would say that education, a robust system of education, can serve as a certain buffer against tyranny. That is also the answer to Friedrich Hayek's thesis in Road to Serfdom. Hayek argued the thesis that an intrusive welfare state will eventually engender tyranny, and in many cases that is so. The Soviet Union is the case in point. But what went wrong there? The Soviet Union was strong on technique, meaning that they produced great engineers, they produced excellent specialists and technicians. But was the Soviet Union really strong when it comes to actual critical thinking and education as Aristotle defined it? I'd certainly say that it was not. And this is the difference between a nanny state or a socialist kind of a government with an extensive social safety net that engenders tyranny, and one that actually lays down the foundation of a democracy. American democracy is in grave peril, as we discussed this in a couple of shows ago when we discussed the Civil War, that the U.S. is in fact, the prospect of civil war, the U.S. is in fact an anocracy. And I believe part of the reason why that is so is the decline in education, the way that Aristotle has defined it. So, if education is to be resolved, to be fixed in America in a way that strengthens the American democracy, we need to address the problem of mcdonaldization. And one obvious implication of this problem is what Bill Bishop wrote about in The Big Sword, that people are so siloed and segregated by interests that they literally have no interest in knowing anything about people that they disagree with politically. This, to me, is a reflection of the failure of education that manifests itself in a very McDonaldized fashion. The only way that can possibly be fixed, I would say, is to insist on a fundamental distinction between knowing how, knowing what, and incentivizing the majority of people to simply pursue the acquisition of practical, employable skills. And as a libertarian, I don't want to say that we need some kind of a government initiative for that. But if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. However, true education must be reserved for the very few who are actually capable of being an educated person in the Aristotelian sense of the word. In that sense, there should be no shame in telling somebody that at the age of 15, perhaps they're better off learning a craft rather than continuing to study history or philosophy or chemistry. That needs to be changed on a fundamental cultural level in America. We need to step away from the idea that college is for everybody, or that knowledge is to be democratized, as John Dewey used to say, because that ship has sailed. Unfortunately, there is no way to strengthen our democracy by making knowledge accessible to everybody, by making academic credentials accessible to everybody. The best way to make education truly productive is to reserve it for the people who can actually do it. But if we overcrowd the universities with incompetent students, all we're doing is ruining it for everybody, and the net result will be negative for almost everybody.
All right, we'll go into final statements. I will end mine with a quote. As with usual, most of these problems began with the Rockefellers. This is from General Education Board, 1913. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, We work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we have set before ourselves is very simple, as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just the way they are. So we will organize our children into a little community and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their mothers and fathers are doing in an imperfect way in their homes, in their shops, and on the farm. Okay, Keith, final thoughts.
I suspect if anything were to generate a paradigm shift in education, it would probably be brought about for financial reasons. The more and more we have these students that have these former students who have these large student loan debts, the more that's going to create a debt bubble in the economy. And there are potentially serious economic repercussions for that in the future. So it may be that at some point in the future, we will have something like what has been floated about in recent times, like student loan debt forgiveness, or switching to a model where college is more like public school, where it's essentially free as a public service. Although I don't know that that would improve the quality of education. If anything, it would probably reduce the quality, because then college would just be another 4 years of public school, which is kind of like what it is now. So for there to be a fundamental paradigm shift, I think what Aleksey is saying is correct, in the sense that there's going to have to be a recognition that not everyone is academic material. It needs to be recognized that from the early grades on, there are going to be some kids who should be in vocational schools. There are some that should be in remedial training. There should be some that are in training for more advanced academic tracks. And there was a meme I saw on Facebook a while back that I thought was pretty interesting, talking about all the things they never teach in school that you should be learning. And that is things like how to balance a checkbook, or how to repair your own automobile, or how to fix your household appliances, or things like basic first aid, or all of these life skills that, when you think about it, are a lot more important than trying to teach advanced algebra to 15-year-olds. But they're rarely taught or emphasized in school. If they're taught at all, they're treated as joke classes and relegated to elective status. So probably the restructuring of education would have to involve a multi-layered educational system, where different types of students, depending on their aptitude and interest and goals and ability, are in different types of academic programs. That is, students with an aptitude and interest in the sciences, they're going to be put in an academic program that is scientifically oriented, or mathematically oriented, or technologically oriented. Whereas there's going to be a lot more students that are going to trade schools, that are going to learn how to be carpenters and auto mechanics and plumbers and electricians and that kind of stuff. And as Aleksey said, there shouldn't be any shame in that. It should just be recognized that some people, that's what they're best at, and that's what they should be doing.
All right, final thoughts, Florian.
Yeah, I'm reminded a little bit about John Taylor Gatto, who was a public school teacher and has basically put forward like advocacy for homeschooling. And he said he agreed with a lot of things that we mentioned here. He also says that there's an overemphasis on conformity, and there's a lack of real world skills, and he advocates that there should be more involvement of family and community. And I guess I completely agree with Keith, Aleksey, and with you, Todd. And like practical skills should not be bad things when people become carpenters or plumbers or whatever, when that's what they're good at. And if we have families and communities more involved and have more decentralized learning, then people also have more skin in the game, and that would then probably also strengthen democracy on the long run, or any functioning societal structure, where it's not going like that like you gotta feel like the middle class is completely depleted while you have a lot of money going to the top, and the bottom kind of like trudges along.
All right. Well, final words for you, Alexey.
Well, so I'd like to pick up where I left off, the implications for democracy. My suggestion was that we should be realistic about what people can achieve as far as the actual episteme aspect of real education is concerned, and leave the technique to the people who are obviously best off doing that. I would guess that, just judging by the available statistics, that probably episteme, true education, should be reserved for a maximum of 20% of students. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's just take the concept of basic IQ, which refers to problem solving, knowledge acquisition, and application of that knowledge. At the core of it, that's spatial reasoning, math, logic, and verbal reasoning. The reality is that not everybody is equally capable of that. So I would say that true education traditionally is reserved for people with an IQ 115 or higher. So that is already the upper 15 percentile. And if we start with that, I think we will have if we start with that and we allow the most intellectually accomplished people to get the best education they can, we'll have the best outcome for democracy as well. Because right now, with the way the system of education works, it's quite difficult for the top 15%, the 15% of the brightest people in our society to get fully educated. And what happens with the other remaining 85%? Well, the reality is that you cannot educate the uneducable. And besides, if they want to be educated, there are so many better ways to do it than going to the university. There are more resources at our disposals than there has ever been. Just imagine somebody's making a good living as an auto mechanic, and he believes that he was mistakenly placed into the trade school, and he wants to get educated. What's stopping him from finding a tutor who will help him learn math, history, and philosophy for something like $30 an hour? And then he will have all the true benefits of education in a way that will allow him to contribute to the democratic society. Yeah, there is also one other fundamental problem. Modern society is changing much more rapidly. It's more dynamic. It evolves more. So the chances are, the chances of ordinary people understanding all these complex political shifts and economic trends and cultural variations are quite low. So what I suggest is that we just make the most of this, accept that our society will probably be less democratic than it used to be. But if we do not want to give up on democracy, let's just do the best with what we have. The top 15% of people need to get the best possible education. Yet they also need to be advised adequately that this does not make them superiors, does not make them intellectual elite, and there should be a clear message there. That there is no such thing as inferior work that's judged by academic standards.
All right. Before we close out, we have one super chat from Blog of the West for $9.99 US for the group. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Keith, Florian, and Alexey. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.